It is January 21st, 3063. Before the battle for Eiston City, conflict with far greater intensity kicked off at the distant Rensic Spaceport, the current landing site for the Polaris Security Fortress-class dropship, the North Star. Polaris had been on planet for several weeks now, and were becoming intimately familiar with their patrol routes, to the point of becoming bored with them. Alpha Lance, serving as both the battalion HQ and primary defending unit of Polaris assets at the spaceport, observed the day-to-day operations of the trading port. Nothing marked this day as a special day, with several small trading craft disembarking their cargo and lifting off again, a normal sight for a periphery world dependent on others for necessities. The sensors of the North Star were not as effective once in the muggy confines of the Orkney atmosphere, and almost failed to notice an unregistered vessel entering planetary orbit from an unknown origin vector. Shortly after registering this alarming contact, communications beyond the confines of the spaceport ceased entirely. Met with only static, Commander Bridgewater was unable to raise the remainder of his battalion, scattered as they were across the continent on their normal patrol routes. There would be no time to send couriers. Tarian planetary militia forces, now on maximum alert, began scrambling to deploy defenders. The bulk of the military hardware had already departed for Capellan space to uphold their end of the treaty signed by Grover Schraplin. But several armored vehicles mobilized upon the spaceport tarmac. Outer perimeter guard towers only managed a brief report of contact before being quickly silenced. Without solid intelligence to formulate a better plan, and no way to signal for the recall of his battalion, Commander Bridgewater ordered his lance to prepare for contact with an enemy of unknown size and origin. The North Star was the only way off the planet. If they could not survive the onslaught of these mysterious and well-organized foes, there would be no chance of survival for any of the scattered members of Polaris. Soon, an entire company of hostile battle mechs breached the perimeter of the walled city of Rensic. The enemy company on the field consists of a fire support lance, a medium battle lance, and a regular battle lance. Planetary garrison forces consist of a lance of striker vehicles, as well as a lance comprised of SRM carriers and laser-equipped Hetzer vehicles. Lastly, Polaris Security Lance Alpha of Able Company, led by Commander Paul Bridgewater in his Blood-Asp Prime. Second in command is his right-hand man, Lieutenant Landon Carpenter in his Devastator. Sergeants Dana Watcher and Nico Clemens round out the lance in their Caesar and Warhammer, respectively. The battle took place at the breached perimeter wall. A civilian residential area was located here. Wanting to minimize civilian casualties but lacking time for a full evacuation, defenders were caught by the attacking force. Commander Bridgewater ordered the collected forces to ready themselves, intending to shield civilian residences. The scenario played was a King of the Hill variation, hold them off. One objective: the defender gains 100 VP each turn they successfully defend the point from attackers. The attackers gain 300 points per turn if they hold the objective. with the game ending after 3 consecutive turns with the objective under attacker control. The defenders were considered to be desperate, as this is one of the most critical facilities on the entire planet. This allows them to ignore the forced withdrawal rule. Round 1. The invaders had split their forces, simultaneously breaching the wall in 2 points to the west and the east. Alpha Lance maneuvered to lock down lanes of fire on either side. The planetary garrison vehicles did their best to remain hidden from view. The battle and command lances of the invading force marched en masse from the west breach. The fire support lance encircled via the east breach. In the opening shots of the engagement, the Vindicator traded shots with Clemens' Warhammer, striking a point of armor from the venerable mech. The Hunchback pilot took advantage of Bridgewater's exposure of rear armor, letting loose a mighty barrage, but failed to do significant damage to the Blood Asp. The Wolverine opted for the more obvious target and dealt minor damage to the thick hide of Lieutenant Carpenter's Devastator. Meanwhile, Bridgewater unleashed a hellish volley from his Blood Asp, marking the enemy archer in the fire support lance for destruction. Carpenter's Devastator followed his lead and drilled his own Gauss weaponry into the unfortunate mech. The combined onslaught slagged 11 points of damage away from the archer, reducing it to the barest minimum of remaining structure and critically damaging the fusion engine within. Clemens' return fire at the Vindicator proved to be ineffective, splashing against the thick debris shielding the mech. The entire command lance of Invader battle mechs attempted to leverage Bridgewater's exposed flank. The cover in the distance proved to be ample defense, however. The civilian structure did not escape the stray fire and suffered heavy damage. Civilians cried out and fled the scene, scattering throughout the surrounding city in a mad stampede to escape the devastation. The coinciding return fire from the fire support lance targeted Bridgewater alone. They recognized that his terrifyingly powerful clan technology posed the greatest danger to them. The warheads erupting around the assault mech only managed to dislodge a paltry few points of armor, however. Remaining hidden from hostile fire, the vehicle crews motioned angrily at civilians and ushered them in the direction of safety to the rear. Round 2. Commander Bridgewater unveiled his uncanny combat intuition and executed his actions so quickly that the invaders had no time to respond. He maneuvered his mech into position rapidly and discharged his full arsenal into the advancing Crusader, opening giant rents in its armor and reducing its armor effectiveness completely. It also inflicted a critical hit upon the Crusader's weaponry. Wresting back control of the initiative, the invaders outmaneuvered the defenders and were able to anticipate their movements. The Hetzers raced into the street, tailed by a pair of SRM carriers, now free to position themselves without the hindrance of civilian obstruction. Hoping to prevent further collateral damage to civilian infrastructure, they positioned themselves as far from the safety of the buildings as they could muster. The medium battle lance moved to take up firing positions opposite the block's central clearing. This vantage point provided clear lines of fire into the defending Polaris mechs. The defenders anticipated this and timed their own movements to square off with the oncoming lance, avoiding the cover of the undamaged residences as much as possible. Bridgewater ordered Carpenter's Devastator back to support the main defense, confident that he could hold his own against the fire support lance to his front. The Invader command lance spread out to prevent the garrison vehicles from easily flanking the slow mechs. The Striker Lance raced into the street behind the carriers and Hetzers, arming a volley of long-range missiles. The Crusader and the Archer of the Fire Support Lance, having suffered near-catastrophic damage and still remaining close to their point of entry, opted to cede the battlefield while they could. Both mechs retreated past the barrier and out of sight. Carpenter delivered a powerful blow to the Invader Hunchback with the intent of crippling its ability to bring its deadly AC-20 to bear. Many shots connected, stripping 5 points of armor off the Invader and leaving its structure exposed. Dana, in her Caesar, battered the enemy Panther, dealing 4 damage and inflicting a critical hit on the motive systems of the lighter mech. Clemens' Warhammer lashed the enemy Vindicator with particle projection cannon fire, evaporating 2 points of armor and scoring a through-armor critical hit. This damage reduced some of the Vindicator's weaponry to ash. The entire medium battle lance fired upon the Devastator, shredding 5 points of armor, but failed to do any critical damage to the Juggernaut. The Laser Hetzers dealt 3 armor damage to the Guillotine, armor running in molten rivers down the Star League-era mech. The Guillotine did not let this affront go without reprisal, and drilled his own considerable weaponry into the lead Hetzer, damaging the hapless vehicle's weaponry in the fuselage. The Marauder joined in on the garrison vehicles, preemptively striking the lighter Striker vehicles as they snap off an LRM payload. The Striker exploded, showering hot armor splinters and debris across the street. Finishing what the Guillotine started, the Crockett finished the lead Hetzer with a viciously accurate attack. There were no survivors in the ensuing blaze. The LRM barrage rained down upon the Invader heavies. The Guillotine received another 3 damage to the armor, leaving it unprotected against further attacks. Meanwhile, the Catapult and the Cyclops both squared off with Bridgewater's Blood Asp. The Catapult's missile volley scattered wide and failed to do significant damage to the clan-made mech, but the Cyclops' autocannon connected in a detonation that stripped 3 additional points of damage from the commander's behemoth. Half of the armor protection on the mech remained. Round 3. The Guillotine, now fully exposed without the protection of armor, sprinted back through the breach and retreated from the field. The Defenders, emboldened by their victories thus far, managed to maintain their initiative and outmaneuver the enemy. The Crockett and the Highlander continued their march down the main street, set on destroying the arrayed vehicles before they could flee or use hit-and-run tactics. The Marauder positioned itself to assist the medium battle lance, as it seemed resistance was too strong for the middleweight formation to dislodge. The 3 remaining Striker vehicles ceded ground to the advancing assault mechs, positioning themselves behind a now empty residential unit. Although minimizing collateral damage was still a priority, crewmen's lives were prioritized over civilian infrastructure. The Hunchback and the Panther, also stripped of armor protection, joined the Guillotine in an exfiltration via the west breach to prevent further damage. The Wolverine and the Vindicator braced themselves in cover. They would try and hold out as long as possible against the heavier Polaris mechs guarding the town square. As the invaders marched down the street, 2 tracked vehicles burst forth from the alleyway and closed in to short range, ready to let volleys of potent SRMs fly. On the east side, the Cyclops and the Catapult continued to encircle Bridgewater's Blood Asp, with the Cyclops bracing itself directly behind a small apartment complex as additional cover. Bridgewater didn't let that stand. He deftly swung his assault mech around the small building, expertly flanking the Cyclops. Lieutenant Carpenter sensed the danger he was in of being flanked by the catapult and put his back to a building to protect the weaker rear armor of his machine. The two sergeants continued to hold lines of fire off the main square. The Vindicator and the Wolverine harassed the Devastator as he repositioned. The thick metal housing of the turbines was enough to shield Carpenter, and the attacks failed to cause damage to his mount. On the west side, the SRM carriers let their fusillade fly. At this range, they were more than deadly, and they managed to inflict massive damage on the targeted Crockett. An arm was sent sailing, weapons included. The laser hetzer scored minor damage to the unprotected rear of the Marauder, but not enough to critically damage any components. The Highlander's returning fire blasted apart the protective armor on the closest SRM carrier's chassis, nearly destroying the firing control equipment of the vehicle. The Crockett's returning fire against the SRM carrier closest to it destroyed armor plating, exposing the structure to the acrid smoke filling the air, but failed to damage anything critical. The Marauder lined up a line of fire on Sergeant Watcher and her Caesar, spreading PPC fire through the surrounding buildings to deal several points of damage to the Polaris Mech. Watcher weathered the fire, but would not be able to sustain many more hits of that strength. Her aim shaken, the responsive fire from the Caesar into the medium Battlelance mechs dealt 2 damage to the Wolverine, but failed to leverage the full might of the Caesar's weaponry. Lieutenant Carpenter did not make the same mistake, driving melon-sized slug after melon-sized slug of ferro-nickel into the Wolverine, dealing a further 5 damage to the medium mech. Both weapon and motive systems shredded under the impacts. On the east end, the Blood Asp took advantage of the invader Cyclops' carelessness. At such ranges, the bird-legged assault mech could act with a savagery that its nearly comical appearance would not suggest. Although no critical components were damaged in the assault, the Cyclops was left with no armor protecting its internal systems. The Cyclops and Catapult, unable to turn fast enough to keep with Bridgewater's mech, opted instead to go for Lieutenant Carpenter as their target. The resulting barrage left craters and pockmarks in the buildings surrounding him, but little damage resulted from the attack. Round 4. After the devastating losses of the prior rounds, it was becoming obvious to the invaders that they would be unable to dislodge the defenders from this defensive position. The remaining invaders withdrew, ceding the field. It was clear to Commander Bridgewater that this was more than a hit-and-run raid. The care of the invaders to ensure that their equipment remained operational belied a long-term goal. The communications failures could not be an accident, either, and had to be jamming. What was worse, without any confirmed engine kills on the field, there were no ejecting pilots to capture and interrogate, no material to salvage or investigate. Who were these unknown invaders? They were too well equipped for the pirate raids common to the worlds in the periphery. What were their goals? Why attack Orkney? With so many questions left unanswered, Bridgewater had limited options. First priority was the dropship. The North Star was the only way they could escape if the situation continued to deteriorate. That meant his heavy lance could not strike out in a counterattack and could not pursue the retreating invaders. He ordered his lance back to the North Star to undergo field repairs as rapidly as possible. Who knew when the invaders would return and what forces they would bring with them? Commander Bridgewater needed force projection. He needed scouts. He needed to find the source of the jamming and eliminate it. Anchored as they were to the defense of the spaceport, his lance could not achieve this goal. All he could do is hope that his patrolling lances would somehow return to the spaceport, if any yet survived. The first shells of artillery began to fall when dusk arrived, January 23rd of 3063.